Hey, this is Brent Leary, and I am. I know you guys probably get tired of me saying I'm still in Vegas, but I literally am still in Vegas. The seventh time this year already I've been in Vegas. Like, I almost feel like I can't get away from it. But it's Pega World 2019, and Sam Charrington. I think I met you either last Pega World or
Last
the
year.
one before
This
that.
is my second.
Second. All right, so it was definitely last year. And it's a pleasure to meet you. Let me introduce you. You're a founding and principal analyst for CloudPulse, but I think probably most people know you from This Week in Machine Learning and AI, right?
That's right. It's a podcast I started 3 years ago.
First of all, that's right. I think I just saw you just had your 3-year anniversary.
Yeah, I think we announced it last week. 3 years and 5 million downloads.
Okay, man. Congratulations on both counts.
Thank you.
That's
Thank
awesome.
you.
And so you were actually kind of early, because I remember I'm in the CRM space, and I think it was the Dreamforce of 2016 where Salesforce announced Einstein, and that kind of put AI on the map from like a CRM standpoint, and they kind of expanded, and because Mark Benioff, what he says, a lot of people listen to. You could start seeing AI take off, but you were a little ahead of that, so that's really cool. Where's your background in? Was it in some kind of machine learning, data science, or anything like that?
No, so I've been an independent industry analyst for about 8 years now. And in fact, when I started my firm, kind of the initial idea or kind of thesis was that with cloud coming online and big data technologies, it was just clear that enterprises would need to do more smarter, intelligent things with their data in order to fully capture its value. And so I started following some of the activity in machine learning and AI then, and it was super early then. One of the first articles I wrote about was about how a set of tools that were coming online to help enterprises do machine learning. At the time, most of those companies aren't still around, but 7 years later, the space is really blossoming.
So we've been here, the last day and a half, 2 days or so, and Pega got started pretty early talking about automation or robotics automation and AI. So what have been your impressions of some of the things that have come out, some of the main themes that have come out of the conference so far?
So yeah, today was the keynote that I was looking forward to. Rob Walker was unveiling some of the company's work on AI and empathy, which is kind of interesting. He was on my show not too long ago talking about some of the things that they were thinking in this space, and it is starting down the path of productization. I think they said it will be out later in the year. But it's it's an interesting idea. The idea is that they want to allow companies to trade off kind of explicitly, via like a slider or a dial or something, between offers that really take into account the context of a customer and what the customer's intent is and what the customer's need is versus the company's motivation, the profit motive. And I think I don't know that a lot of companies are thinking explicitly about like, okay, there are some offers that are, they're good for us, and there are other offers that are, good for the company or ill-time, or rather for the customer, or ill-time for the customer. And these are things that we should be, this is a decision spectrum that we should manage. So I think just starting that conversation will be a big deal for a lot of companies.
You hear about AI, you hear about machine learning, you hear about deep learning. What is the biggest misconception about this area that just drives you crazy every time you hear
it? That's a good question. I think that I think generally the thing that drives me crazy is just, there are all sorts of statements that kind of give you the impression that the person who's making the statement thinks that AI is magic.
Right.
And, doesn't really, kind of belies that they don't really understand the process behind making it all work. And that certainly drives me crazy. I think, in part because it's a dangerous proposition. I think one of the things that was talked about in Rob's talk today was, some of the dangers of AI bias and things like that. And if you don't understand, that these models that we're putting into use are created by data, and they pick up on biases that are inherent in that data, then you probably don't know that that's something that you should be thinking about and trying to manage.
Right. So you talk to a lot of people in this space and a lot of companies that are implementing AI and machine learning. Do you feel like they're actually ready to take full advantage of this? Or what are the things that they possibly aren't kind of prepared for as they start going down the line with this?
Yeah, it's definitely a spectrum, as it always is, right? There are some companies that are more mature than others. One of the things that I'm seeing a lot of and have been speaking a lot about recently is that among large enterprises, a lot of them are kind of in this really interesting place where they spent the last 2 or 3 years, maybe 5, depending on how early they were, doing machine learning and AI proof of concepts, building out, they're kind of building out their initial data science organizations and experimenting with, building models, and the, often the use cases that they'll start out with are things like churn prediction or, recommendation systems or things like that. It depends a lot on the industry. But they've got a handful of these proof of concepts up and running, and, they've been kind of selling within the enterprise. And they're all at this place where all of a sudden everyone's bought in. Like they've had some interesting early results, executives are, reading about it on airplanes, what's your AI strategy? And they're seeing these interesting results and they're like, okay, let's get AI in everything, right? And most of the enterprises that I've talked to, aren't really ready to kind of scale that up, in that they don't know how. And understanding how to scale that up requires thinking differently about your processes, but also your tooling and platforms, than just adding on another kind of snowflake project, right? And so this topic of AI platforms is one that we've been covering a lot on the podcast, one that I've been writing a lot about, publishing some ebooks on. In fact, we just announced that we're hosting a conference in the fall on the topic.
Nice. Where's that going to be?
It's going to be in SF, San Francisco.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
When are the dates?
October 1st and 2nd in San Francisco. It's called TWiML&AI Platforms.
Very cool.
TWiML&AI.com.
There you go. Got to get it all out there, man.
Yep.
So you've been following this at least through your site for a little over 3 years now. What have been some of the biggest changes in the space? Not necessarily the perceptions that companies have of it, but just how has it changed in your eye as you've been watching this?
Yeah, it's there are so many interesting things happening. I think just compared 3 years ago to today. 3 years ago, it was just an idea, right? And you talk to companies about this idea, and they'd be intrigued, but not really understand what you're talking about. Nowadays, there's usually someone or some, usually more than one, usually a group of folks that are, really working on this stuff now. So I think in that way, in that sense, it's become real, from an enterprise perspective. I think from a technology perspective, it's also moving incredibly quickly. So, 3 years, we're starting to have some interesting results in areas like, the application of deep learning to like computer vision. And now I was here in Vegas just a few months ago for CES, and like every other booth at CES, had a camera, was showing bounding boxes around detected objects in a video. Like the technology to do that kind of thing is really becoming commoditized. And a lot of what made that interesting is this technique called transfer learning, basically the ability to train a model and then apply it to other types of models or other data sets. Recently there have been a bunch of developments in applying that same idea to natural language processing. So, on all fronts, the space is moving really quickly.
All right, so what's been like the most interesting, maybe unique, but also the most successful kind of use case you've seen a company actually implement this and see some positive results?
There are a ton. I have a slide in one of my presentations that kind of tongue-in-cheek says that if you want to find an application for AI, just throw a dart at a dartboard, right? There are so many. I talked about some of the sales and marketing use cases like churn prediction or recommendations, identifying next best offer. That's what PEG is all about and talks about frequently.
Yep.
But there are applications in logistics, understanding and optimizing your supply chain, tons of applications there. Certainly, for companies that are in industrial sectors, I wrote an ebook on industrial AI a couple of years ago. There are lots of applications in robotics and IoT. The whole idea of digital twin is becoming an interesting one. Basically, for companies that have significant kind of industrial assets, whether these are like generators or oil rigs or aircraft engines. A GE aircraft engine has some, several thousand sensors in it, just a single engine. And so they're collecting a ton of data. And a company like GE is trying to kind of shift their business model from one of, selling this physical asset to selling, engine as a service, if you will, right? And so part of what allows them to do that is the ability to kind of anticipate when the engine's going to fail. Predictive maintenance is one of the big use case. And one of the techniques that they have long evangelized for doing that is what they call digital twin. It's basically kind of IoT plus AI plus simulation, right? So you pull all of the sensor data off of your engine, you use it to create a set of models about the engine that you can use in a simulation environment to predict how different factors are going to impact the performance of the engine.
So in other words, there's more and more time goes by, there's more and more use cases coming up.
For someone like me that just loves to kind of learn and understand and study, it's like being a kid in a candy store. There's so many ways that folks are applying this stuff.
So if we were to peer out 2 years, or I don't know, maybe 5 years, whatever the time frame is, what do you see happening in the future, in the near future, when it comes to this area in terms of use cases, adoption, and success in companies?
Yeah, I think I think that in 5 years we'll be kind of beyond this, the stutter step point that I mentioned, where enterprises have figured out how to do the one-off, machine learning project, and they'll have the platforms and processes in place to repeatedly put models into production. One of the observations that I've been making is that it's a mistake to think of machine learning and AI as like another technology, and I think it's more a kind of another wave or frontier in business, right? So this other sequence that I have in the presentation I gave yesterday talks about how, you know, in the 80s and 90s, it was all about being process driven. It was like, you know, let's get our business processes out of managers and you know, line folks' head and kind of document them, right? And then we moved into this era in the 2000s that was all about being data driven. Hey, we've got these processes, you know, can we automate them? Can we instrument them and kind of pull some data and use that data to make, you know, help us make decisions? But it's usually like, you know, let's create the TPS report every quarter and have somebody
I love that movie.
make some business decisions based on these TPS reports, right? And so now we're, you know, shifting into this era of being model driven, and model driven in this case refers to creating machine learning models that, you know, pull patterns and insights out of this data and puts it in a real production so that you know, we've dramatically decreased the lag between kind of an insight and decisions being made, because the machines are making the decisions, right? Sometimes with our help, with people's help, but more and more of these decisions, you know, will be seeded to kind of online systems that are making decisions at the point that they're required. And so I think, you know, this is a new idea now, but in 5 years, this will be, I think, apparent to a lot of companies, and they'll be very heavily invested in going down this path.
And does that possibly then free up humans to leverage their empathy and allow machines to help them with the decision making?
Yeah, I think that's the idea. But going back to Rob's presentation, you know, there are interesting opportunities to allow the machines to exhibit some kind of empathy. And now I don't think of that, and I don't think he does either, in like some, you know, what we call AGI, artificial general intelligence, like, you know, movie, sci-fi AI, but more, you know, kind of being explicit about these trade-offs and, you know, baking that kind of explicit knowledge or consideration of these trade-offs into the systems that we build around these models.
And also he mentioned, and I kind of agree, in some instances, some people lack empathy just in general. So, you know, sometimes maybe the machines will be more empathetic. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, you talked to him. I talked to him about this yesterday, and you know, he's very quick to say that, you know, they're out evangelizing, you know, to their customers to be more empathetic, or at least to think about it as part of, you know, their customer experience transformation, right? But if the company is led by someone who is not empathetic, it's probably not going to work.
Not going to be a really good ending there. But anyway, let's hope for the best.
Yeah.
Hey, this has been real fun. Tell people once
Absolutely.
again where they can read and go and listen to the podcast, and a little bit more about the event.
Absolutely. So the podcast is available any place you might want to listen to podcasts. The best place to get started is TWiML&AI.com. And if you're interested in learning more about our conference, that's TWiMLCon.com, and TWiML is TWiML.
Awesome. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you.
And that's it.